Hello and welcome to Third Thursday at Hoover's. I'm Brad Reiner's Communications Director at the Hoover Presidential Foundation. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have a very interesting program for you tonight with a presenter who knows an awful lot about the subject matter, Herbert Hoover and Abe Lincoln. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you of a few upcoming programs for you to share with your friends and family. The Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum has opened a new temporary exhibit in the Corton Gallery called 1968, A Folsom Redemption. It features details on the performances Johnny Cash made at the prison from photos and stories by two journalists who were there. It also details Hoover's plans for prison reform. The exhibit is only open through March 19th, so don't wait too long. Come and see it. We have two other programs I'd like to tell you about. The first is our Uncommon Public Service Award program, which was created to honor our Iowa state legislators for uncommon service above and beyond their legislative duties. We're asking for your help in nominating an Iowa state representative or senator who exemplifies Herbert Hoover's ideals of honesty, integrity, and uncommon public service. But we need you to do it soon. Nominations close on March 1st. You can do this easily online at our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org, where you'll find the link under the Grants and Awards tab. Now, also due in March, on the 15th, are applications for the Uncommon Student Award program. It's for Iowa high school juniors only. So to apply, they need to enter an idea for a community service or entrepreneurial project of their own design and simply tell us about their plans. We'll select 15 of these students in May who will then spend their summer working on these projects and report the results back to us in October. Each of the 15 will earn a $1,500 cash award, and 4 of them will earn a $10,000 scholarship. So to apply, you visit uncommonstudent.org. But don't wait until the last minute. They need to put some thought into this and collect a couple of references as well. So please tell your school, your library, your family, your friends about this program. You'd be amazed at the projects these students develop and the leadership skills they gain. Also on our website, you can learn about a major fundraising campaign for the renovation of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum exhibit space. It's been 30 years since that last renovation, and we're excited about bringing new technology and other updates into the museum. We have special benefit for Iowa taxpayers who contribute to the Timeless Values campaign, where you can earn an Iowa state tax credit equal to 25% of your gift of any size, no matter how much the gift is. There's still funds available from the state, but they won't last forever. So I urge you to consider making your gift soon. Now, as for tonight's program, I encourage you to enter any questions you have for our speaker in the Q&A link found at the edge of your screen. You can even vote for someone else's question if it's of interest to you, as questions with more votes tend to get asked first. As I mentioned before, tonight's presenter is a well-known scholar when it comes to Abe Lincoln and Herbert Hoover, because he's currently the director of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum and was previously the director of the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield. I particularly enjoy the little-known stories that he shares about these presidents, and I'm sure you will too. Tom, welcome back. I'm looking forward to your presentation tonight.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate that generous introduction. On February 12th, 1940, a New York newspaper decided to have a little bit of fun and show what some of the leading Republican candidates for president might look like if they had an Abe Lincoln beard. And there you see Mr. Hoover bearded. And although they meant it in fun, unbeknownst to them, there was much more similarities and an influence of Lincoln on Hoover than they would have ever imagined. So we all know Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. This is not the original. The original undoubtedly does not exist, but they've reconstructed facsimiles on some of the homestead sites in Kentucky. There were at least 3, and we know that his father was an industrious farmer, and who supplemented his income with carpentry, a skill that he taught Lincoln. The problem his father had was, although he acquired over 1,000 acres of land, Kentucky was created out of the colony of Virginia. It wasn't created with the Northwest Ordinance, where you buy the Northwest Ordinance, you buy the land directly from the federal government, so you know you have clear title. In Kentucky, people were often on land that they did not own, and they would sell it, and the unfortunate buyer, in this case Thomas Lincoln, found out that most of the land that he owned, he did not have clear title to. So he moved his family across the river to Indiana, which was created out of the Northwest Ordinance. He bought his land directly from the federal government. And everything was going well. And then Lincoln's mother died from milk sickness. Thomas Lincoln really didn't have the ability to take care of two children. So he went back to Kentucky, found a woman that he had known, and she was a widow. So they got married, and she brought her 3 children to Indiana and created the blended family with Thomas Lincoln's 2 children. Sarah Bush Johnson was a very loving and mentoring influence on the young Abraham Lincoln, taught him to read passages from the Bible. And although Lincoln, as he in an autobiography indicated, that he learned by littles, most of the time he had to spend working in the field with his father, generating income for the family. So he didn't have really much formal schooling at all, but he became a voracious reader and read anything he could lay his hands on. And that's how he learned about the wider world at large. What he got from his father was the ability to tell engaging stories. He was a jokester. His father liked jokes. And he was also a mimic. He would often stand on tree stumps and imitate itinerant preachers who would stand on the tree stump and try to save souls. It's no surprise that later in life, the joke books he liked emphasized dialect, especially of immigrant groups like the Irish, the Dutch, the Germans. That mimicry, though, also served him in another way, and that Lincoln learned that words need to be put together to provide clear meaning. But he also understood that words are remembered better if they are put together in a lyrical fashion. And so, of all the presidents we've had, probably most of you in the audience can recite a few lines from a Lincoln speech, the Gettysburg Address or a second inaugural. And that's largely due to the fact he spent a long time not only in providing clear meaning in his sentences, but also kind of flowing and almost musical quality to them. Now, Lincoln was a self-made man. The 19th century version of self-made had 2 components. Most people know the first, and that is improving oneself in a material fashion. The notion of going from rags to riches, bettering oneself. But more important in the 19th century, and understand that 19th century America was largely an evangelical Christian population. These are the people who are concerned about their soul. And so self-made to them, it was just as important to develop and make your moral core, your character, to be a person of good reputation, whose word is their obligation. And they also realize that they have something more than just their own betterment, but that they have an obligation to their neighbor and to their community. And so, understanding the 19th century version of self-made, it's just not bettering oneself materially, but improving one's character. Lincoln stayed with his parents. His father moved from Indiana to Illinois. They settled in Decatur. Lincoln stayed with them on that move. When he turned 21, he left and was hired by Denton Offutt, who wanted him to help him float a flatboat of goods down to New Orleans. And so Lincoln decided to do that. He had already done flatboat trips from Indiana. He was very familiar with navigating the rivers, and being 6'4" nearly and very strong. He was just the perfect person to have in your crew. When he got back to New Salem, he ended up buying the store from Denton Offutt, along with William Barry. But the biggest problem on the frontier was that there wasn't a lot of what we call hard currency, that is, gold and silver coins. Banks existed, they issued their own bank currency, but typically they didn't have a lot of equity. And so they didn't have enough capital in order to cover all of the banknotes they were printing. And so typically these banknotes were on a weekly basis depreciated, and their actual depreciated value was you could find in certain publications. This meant that most of the people who are doing business traded IOUs, or promissory notes. That was fine as long as whoever had your promissory note didn't call it due. And if they did, the sheriff would come and collect all of your physical property and sell it at a public auction. And then those proceeds would go to pay the person holding your note. Now, we all know this story about Lincoln's goods being sold and a friend buying a horse and bridle and returning it to Lincoln. No one actually bothered to look at the sheriff's note, the inventory. It wasn't a horse, it was a house on half lots in New Salem. And the half lots and the house were pulled from the auction. The house was probably the Denton Offutt store, which Lincoln ran with Barry. And so he was allowed to continue his livelihood. What that debt did, however, was it was a very powerful motivation. And so looking at the next few occupations that Lincoln had, he volunteered in the state militia for the Black Hawk War for 2 28-day gigs. He was appointed postmaster. He was elected to the state legislature, and then taught himself surveying. All of these occupations paid in hard currency, which indicates Lincoln was able to climb out of debt. As a surveyor, he did 6 complete town surveys. Now this, for a long time, historians thought that this map of Huron was a paper town, meaning that it only existed here on paper, that people never actually settled in this area. Archaeology that I was involved in on this site showed that, in fact, it was settled. It had a post office. It had a very lively tavern, which was probably used as the way that timeshares are, where they'll invite you out and they'll liquor you up and try to get you to buy lots. What's most important, though, is looking up at the top. You see the slough, and then you see this solid line that's a proposed canal. Lincoln was a person of vision, and that's reflected in the things that interested him in the Illinois legislature, as well as on this map. He understood that for individuals who moved to Illinois on the frontier to remain and to prosper, that they needed to have access to larger ports and larger avenues of capital. In the legislature, he focused on what today we consider arcane subjects of banking, but banking was all important because that was access to capital. For providing internal improvements, canals, roads, bridges, later railroads, all of these were important, and getting farm goods from the interior to, again, larger cities and areas where there were better markets. So you're seeing with this map of Huron that Lincoln was really kind of setting a blueprint for economic development in Illinois. Now, he's the only president that we've had that was awarded a patent. And again, it's no surprise. What is this patent for? Well, Lincoln, New Salem is on the Sangamon River, and anyone familiar with the Sangamon River knows that it dries up to a trickle in the summer. And so Lincoln invented these billows that if a vessel got caught on a sandbar in the low season of water, they would drop down, inflate, and theoretically lift the boat over the sandbar or other obstacle in the river. It was never manufactured, in large part because the weight of the invention probably offset the benefit. But again, you're seeing kind of Lincoln's mind at work and trying to overcome obstacles and provide, again, for individual enrichment and development. Now, Lincoln, although his father was a farmer, once Lincoln left New Salem, he had to make a decision. And he had to choose between whether he wanted to study to become a blacksmith or a lawyer. He picked law. And in a way, he was separating himself from the majority of Americans who were involved in agrarian pursuits, and associated himself with this growing group of professionals, doctors, lawyers. And his income from law ended up providing him with an annual income of $3,000 to $5,000. Unlike many of his colleagues who used their insider information, knowing where railroad lines were going to be built, and so they bought up the land before the railroad and then sold it at a profit, Lincoln didn't do that. His income outside of his law practice was essentially lending money to friends and associates at the standard rate at that time of 10% interest. So in a sense, Lincoln was kind of had his own bank. This is a Frank Leslie's cartoon when Lincoln was elected president, and it's called Gulliver Lincoln. All of those people climbing all over him are not Lilliputians, but rather are office seekers, people who believe that they served the party so well that they deserve some kind of reward on the government payroll. Now, Lincoln started out his career not as a party man, but rather focusing on the individual. The founding generation, the Constitution doesn't talk about political parties. And in fact, many of the founders talked about the evils of what they called factions. And so the emphasis was always on the ability of the individual. That changed under the election of Andrew Jackson. And Martin Van Buren, who was the Secretary of State and then became his vice president in the second term, essentially built the Democratic Party organization under the charismatic popularity of Jackson. What the party that Van Buren created did was it was able to eliminate all of the fights of people thinking that they could become president. There was a convention, and the party chose the slate rather than having individuals willy-nilly decide, oh, I'm going to run for this or that. And therefore, rather than dividing votes among 5 or 6 people thinking they were worthy of being president, they could consolidate around one candidate. The other thing, though, is that party required certain elements of us in order to provide party cohesion. One of those was patronage. Anti-Jackson people, and Lincoln considered himself anti-Jackson and not a Whig at this time, referred to it as a spoil system. But, Jackson replied, to the victor belong the spoils. Lincoln eventually becomes a Whig. 1840s, they elect their first successful Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, who dies 30 days later. But Lincoln then becomes a strong proponent of party politics and party organization. So patronage, loyalty to the candidate, even someone you may not like who's the head of the ticket. And most importantly, Lincoln learns that to be successful, you need to shape public opinion. Public opinion is all important. And if you don't have public opinion behind you and your policies, you won't be successful. He also understood that politics has an element of theater in it, and that it's just not giving a good speech, but delivering it with some theatrics in order, again, to get the audience to empathize with you, to show that you're enthused about what you're saying. And of course, given Lincoln's longtime skills in storytelling and joke telling and mimicry, he had quite an arsenal in his delivery, which is one of the reasons why he was so popular as a public speaker. His presidency, 6 southern states had already left the Union before he took the oath of office, and then 5 more would leave after. What this did is that it removed Southern Democrats from Congress, giving Republicans an easier avenue of passing the kind of legislation that they wanted that was in their party platform. Presidential candidates at that time pretty much adhered to what was stated in the platform. And so much of the blueprint for modern America was set by the Republican Congresses during Lincoln's presidency. Things like the National Currency Act, the Morrill Act, which set up land-grant colleges. The Department of Agriculture was created under Lincoln. The Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act. All of these were very important and kind of, again, moving America forward, bringing kind of a scientific approach to agriculture, and more importantly, I think what it allowed is that Lincoln could focus on running the war rather than having to push through specific legislative pieces. Now, this print by Alexander Hay Ritchie shows Lincoln reading the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. So much has been misstated about what the Emancipation Proclamation did and didn't do. When Lincoln took office, he did not indicate that it was going to be a war to end slavery, but rather that it was a war for union. What Lincoln understood was that most Northern whites were more interested in reuniting the country than in fighting a war over slavery. What Lincoln understood, however, and what he argued before he became president, he always said that he believed that blacks fit the definition of men in the Declaration, which declares all men are created equal. He argued that he didn't believe that blacks were his political or social equals, but in the economic sense, that they should be able to keep the fruits of their own labor and not have someone else take it from them. He believed that blacks were his equal and everyone else's. Now, he understood that making that argument, again, opened him up to all sorts of attacks. But in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he did it under his war powers as president, and essentially indicated that Southern states in rebellion had 100 days to drop their arms and to end their conflict. And if they didn't, that on January 1st, 1863, that the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect and all enslaved people in those areas in rebellion would be free. Now, some people said, well, he didn't really have any authority to impose that. Well, in fact, there were many areas that had already been recaptured by the Union Army. The Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, 10,000 slaves were immediately freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. More importantly, is it made the Army, Union Army, an army of emancipation. And Lincoln included in it encouraging blacks to enlist and wear the Union uniform. At the end of the war, there were roughly 185,000 blacks who were serving the Union forces, which was a huge help. But more importantly, again, as I said, this is an evangelical Christian nation largely that he's speaking to. And what he knew they would understand is the blood sacrifice that Blacks were making in order to secure the Union. And he used that in a speech that was read at a Republican rally in Springfield, where he calls out people who say, there are many of you who say you won't fight for Black freedom, but many of them are willing to fight and die for your Union. Two things then we need to understand. Lincoln's idea of what is the legitimate object of government, and this is a little blurb he wrote. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. And all that the people can do individually do as well for themselves, government ought not interfere. So once again, he sees government has a role, but only in those areas where people individually or collectively are unable to do it. Otherwise, government just needs to back off. In talking again to white troops as they were discharged, he said this to the 166th Ohio Regiment, the White House. I happened temporarily to occupy this big White House. I'm a living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. It is in order that each of you may have through this free government, which we have enjoyed, an open field and fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence, that you may all have equal privileges in the race of life with all its desirable human aspirations. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright, not only for 1, but for 2 or 3 years. The nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel. Again, why all of this bloodshed? Why continue this war? Well, this is what Lincoln saw at the heart of America, this open field and fair chance. And notice he doesn't just say for white America. He believed it belonged to all America. The Emancipation Proclamation allowed him to begin this process of ending slavery. And because it was a war measure, Lincoln knew that once the war was over, that it no longer had any weight of or authority of law, which is why he began the process of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. And that was done and sent to states. Illinois, to its credit, was the first state to ratify it. And however, Lincoln did not live long enough in his second term to see the necessary states ratifying it to make it part of the Constitution. But quickly thereafter, you had the 14th Amendment, which made Black citizens, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to Black males. So again, Lincoln working to shape public opinion in order to achieve what he thought was the birthright of every American, that open field and fair chance. So here we have Herbert Hoover's birthplace. His father was a blacksmith, an occupation that Lincoln thought about, who died when Hoover was 6. Hoover's mother died at the age 9. And so at the age 10, Hoover was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in Oregon, separated from his younger sister and older brother. Hoover didn't really have any loving mentoring figure in his early life the way Lincoln did. However, there was a librarian teacher that introduced him to the wonder of reading and books in Oregon. And like Lincoln, he became a voracious reader, everything that he could lay his hands on. Unlike Lincoln, Hoover was brought up in the Quaker tradition of modesty, the development of the inner life and conscience. But people forget, when they think of Hoover, they often think of a 20th century progressive reformer. And actually, Hoover was pretty much developed many of his instincts from the 19th century and the 19th century idea of self-made, of improving yourself both materially, but his Quaker upbringing taught him the importance of developing character and of conscience. So you get this, again, this 19th century meaning of self-made. Now, unlike Lincoln, Hoover was able to go to college, went to Stanford, majored in geology, and then began his globe-trotting career as a mining engineer. But like Lincoln, Hoover was always able to see the larger picture and envision the more expansive future from almost nothing. In this instance, this is a graph of the Baldwin mines. These are the silver mines in Burma that gave him so much of his fortune. And you see where the proven ore is, the probable ore, and the ways to mine it out. Perhaps even more impressive, showing Hoover as a visionary, though, is the construction of the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam not only controlled floodwaters of the Colorado River, it provided, again, water for agriculture in the 7-state area, and even more important, hydroelectric power for the development of that area. So again, Hoover is always looking at how these things will impact economic development, not only for a region, but for the individuals in that region. Again, kind of this idea that Lincoln had of the open field and fair chance, of internal improvements of economic development. As Secretary of Commerce, again, so much of our modern day life was a foundation that Hoover set in the 20s. The model for the non-governmental organizations, Hoover helped develop with the Commission for Relief in Belgium and then the American Relief Administration. Industrial standards for plumbing, for industry were set by Hoover in the 20s, regulating the airwaves from radio, development of commercial aviation, the National Highway Safety Standards, child health standards. All of these things were a result of Hoover's efforts. Now, this is Ding Darling's depiction of Gulliver Hoover. Unlike Lincoln, who is weighed down by office seekers, Darling shows that Hoover's problems are not office seekers, but are congressional pygmies and the pygmy politicians in Congress. It's Congress that is the obstacle to Hoover's construction programs. Unlike Lincoln, Hoover lived most of his adult life abroad. He wasn't active in political parties. He never worked in the trenches or paid his dues as a party organizer or supporter. And this is why many of the Republican leaders distrusted him. And his life abroad put him at a disadvantage on understanding certain American issues, such as race relations, especially in the South, which he got a lesson by fire during the Mississippi flood in 27. His progressive reform instincts opposed traditional practices for party cohesion, such as patronage. And again, his Quaker reticence prevented him from understanding that the role of the president, the bully pulpit of the presidency that Theodore Roosevelt talked about, the theater involved in being the president, and also the shaping of public opinion. And so, in many ways, Hoover always typically emphasized results rather than process. Lincoln, however, was understood that politics was all about process. Public opinion was all about process. And you could only get the result you wanted by being active in that process. Having been in Europe before, during, and after World War I, decided, had seen Europe convulsed by the Great War. He saw governments come and go and people running to things such as communism in Russia, Bolsheviks, socialism, and central planning as ways to provide a more perfect society. Hoover rejected all of that, and he wrote this little pamphlet, American Individualism. The core of it is essentially that what makes America distinctive and what makes American work is the Lincolnian open field and fair chance, the right to rise, for individuals to have obstacles removed so that they could reach whatever level of attainment their ambitions and skills and talents can take them to. Hoover also gave talks on Lincoln's birthday. He was in Springfield in 31 to rededicate the remodeled Lincoln tomb. Lou, in doing her study of the White House, realized that the Lincoln study that's in this print was broken up by Theodore Roosevelt into bedrooms for his large family. And so what she did is she restored it to its original look, and it became Herbert Hoover's favorite room, workroom in the White House. The Ritchie print that you see, a print was purchased by his grandfather, West Branch Quaker community, and they supported the Republicans in the efforts to eliminate slavery. This passed down in the family. Hoover got it. It hangs outside the Waldorf Gallery in the museum. And let me just end with a speech that Hoover gave in the Lincoln study on Lincoln's birthday on February 12th. By the magic of radio, I'm able to address several hundred public gatherings called this evening throughout our country in celebration of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. It is appropriate that I should speak from this room in the White House, where Lincoln strived and accomplished his great service to our country. Here are the very chairs in which he meditated upon his problems. Above the mantelpiece hangs his portrait with his cabinet, and upon this fireplace is written, "In this room, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, whereby 4 million slaves were given their freedom and slavery forever prohibited in these United States. It was here that he toiled by day and night, that the union created by the fathers might be preserved, and that slavery might be ended. The moment responsibilities of any community, particularly in economic and social questions, are shifted from any part of the nation to Washington, then that community has subjected itself to a remote bureaucracy with its minimum of understanding and of sympathy. It has lost a large part of its voice and its control in its own destiny. Under federal control, the very conditions of life in our country are forced into standard molds, and all their limitations upon life, either of the individual or the community. Where people divest themselves of local government responsibilities, they at once lay the foundation for the destruction of their liberties. And buried in this problem lies something even deeper. The whole of our governmental machinery was devised for the purpose that through ordered liberty, we give incentive and equality of opportunity to every individual to rise to that highest achievement of which he is capable. At once, when government is centralized, there arises a limitation upon the liberty of the individual and a restriction of individual opportunity. The true liberty of the individual, or the true growth of the nation, is the growth of character in its citizens. The spread of government destroys initiative and thus destroys character. Character is made in the community as well as in the individual by assuming responsibilities, not escape from them. Carried to its logical extreme, all the shouldering of individual and community responsibility upon the government can lead but to the superstate, where every man becomes the servant of the state and real liberty is lost. Such was not the government Lincoln sought to build. Victory over this depression and over our other difficulties will be won by the resolution of our people to fight their own battles in their own communities, by stimulating their ingenuity to solve their own problems, by taking new courage to be masters of their own destiny in the struggle of life. This is not the easy way, but it is the American way, and it is the Lincoln way. And I'd be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for that interesting information. We are taking questions. Just type them in on the Q&A feature there. Press that button and type in some questions. While you're doing that, I have a couple of questions for Tom. So who would you say had the best sense of humor between Lincoln or Hoover? You know, they both had been memorialized in cartoons, you know, by Ding Darling. And you know, how did they feel about things like that? Or you know,
so Lincoln obviously is, so much has been written about his jokes, and Lincoln's favorite sort of jokes were puns. He was walking down the street and he saw a business sign that said T.R. Strong, the name of the proprietor, and Lincoln turned to an associate and said, T.R. Strong, coffee are stronger. Hoover, I did an entire podcast, I think it's still available through the DC Improv, on Hoover's humor. And of course, you know, because you're not supposed to bring attention to yourself, Hoover's humor tended to be more deadpan, more kind of dry wit. And so, for example, when asked why he thought he lost the election in 32, he said, well, I think it's because the other side got more votes. I mean, it's just, it's not ha-ha funny, but it's, you know, it brings a smile to one's face.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that Lincoln had recognized that blacks should be included as, the men in the Constitution. Did he ever have any in his cabinet or that he worked with in business? And how does that compare with Hoover as well?
So one of the problems in understanding Lincoln and race is if we bring too many of our modern day assumptions back to the past, it's somewhat unfair. Lincoln, though, of all of the people that were on the train as president-elect that went from Springfield to Washington, D.C., one of them was Black. And it was someone that had done odd jobs for Lincoln, William H. Johnson. When Lincoln got to Washington, he tried to get Johnson a job in the White House staff. And because Johnson was dark-skinned and most of the Black White House servants were light-skinned, they rejected him. So Lincoln ended up being able to get him a job working in the Treasury Department for Salmon P. Chase, who again was had been a Democrat, but was an abolitionist and split with the Democratic Party and joined the Republicans. And so Lincoln knew that he would be accepted. And throughout Lincoln's presidency, he would write these notes and have Johnson do odd jobs for him. Johnson went with Lincoln to Gettysburg, where he delivered that little known or long remembered speech. And Lincoln wasn't symptomatic yet, but had smallpox. And when they got back to Washington, it put him into bed for a couple of weeks. Lincoln recovered, but Johnson didn't. And there's a reporter from one of the newspapers who went to the White House, and Lincoln is counting out money. And he said, "What are you doing?" He said, someone I know is sick and I need to get him his pay warrant. When Johnson dies, Lincoln may have, at his own expense, had him buried in Arlington. We're not quite sure of that. But what is clear is that Lincoln's relationship with him was unusual for the time. And all of his efforts, to remove those obstacles and allow him the right to rise.
Mm-hmm.
With Hoover, again, it's more of a complicated story because, again, he lived abroad for like the first 40 some years of his life. And so while, again, he reflected those kind of Quaker values of equality, and was very active with Robert Moton of Tuskegee and of Howard University, you don't see those kind of close, that same kind of relationship that you saw with Lincoln and Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Karen is asking, did they both regularly go to church?
Well, that's one thing that they shared, and that was an aversion to Sunday worship. Lincoln never joined a church. He never made a confession of faith, but he did attend the First Presbyterian Church with his wife. His wife joined, and the children were members and baptized in that faith. Hoover, again, was brought up in the Quaker Meeting House and the Quietist tradition. I should have emphasized that. or again, you don't talk unless the spirit moves you to speak. Although Lou was raised an Episcopalian, and when she married him, she adopted his Quaker beliefs. They were members of a meeting house in Washington. There is a story that when he attended and they passed the plate, he didn't have any money and had to borrow money from his wife. But you don't see him as a regular attendee at the meeting houses.
Mm-hmm.
Though it's clear that, I mean, both men were very much kind of shaped by their understanding of faith. Lincoln knew the Bible better than most ministers. And Hoover was also very well versed in the Bible as well.
Mm-hmm. Shelley is asking about, well, she says her favorite story about Lincoln is the Effie Afton incident with the first bridge over the Mississippi when Lincoln was an attorney. Is that something that you can?
Well, yeah, there's kind of an apocryphal story about Lincoln and the trial. It's probably not appropriate here for mixed company, but if you want to read about it, there's a great little book called Abe Lincoln Laughing by Paul Zoll, and it's in the introduction.
Okay. Francie says that she's looking forward to attending your symposium on Sunday, February 19th in Springfield after Lincoln's birthday. Is that something that you can tell people about? And then also has a question, how long did Francis Carpenter live in the White House to capture Lincoln and his cabinet on canvas?
Okay. So I was for a long time secretary of the Abraham Lincoln Association and editor of their journal. And we always had it on February 12th on his birthday, no matter when the birthday fell. I understand that because it fell on Super Bowl Sunday, they decided to move it. But if you've never gone, they have a great lineup of speakers. I believe Sidney Blumenthal is the banquet speaker. Terry Alford is the speaker at the lunch named after me. And they also have a number of other authors with recent books out. So it's well worth attending if Lincoln is your interest. And the second part of the question?
Let me bring that back up here. How long did Francis Carpenter live in the White House to capture that? That painting?
So Francis Bicknell Carpenter was a painter, and he realized that the Emancipation Proclamation, he was an abolitionist as well, was a significant moment in history. The actual painting that he did, it hangs in the US Capitol. He then wrote a book about his time in the White House called 6 Months at the White House. Lincoln couldn't always sit for him. And so a good friend of his named Leonard Swett, who was the same height as Lincoln and build, often would substitute Lincoln as a model while Carpenter did the sketches.
Okay. Gwen is asking, did they both write their own speeches? And was Hoover good at delivering speeches, or do we know if he was a good orator?
Yeah. So the answer is that yes. And in fact, Hoover was the last president to write all of his own speeches. And Hoover makes fun of later presidents who used ghostwriters and indicated that for transparency, they need to identify the ghosts so people know who they're voting for. But understand that Thomas Jefferson didn't like public speaking. And so he was the one who began sending the State of the Union, or what was then called the annual message to Congress, which was in December, now called State of the Union, usually in January, February. He would send it, he sent it and had a clerk read it. And that lasted all the way up to Woodrow Wilson, who realized that, you know, with the declaration of war, he wanted to deliver his own messages in his own voice. And so that lasted up to the present. And of course, now it's become this great kind of PR gimmick. But again, it's using kind of that theater and the power of the presidency in order, you know, to amplify messages, to empathize with the public, to shape public opinion. Hoover's delivery was monotone. And a recent book that I read, the author made a very interesting point and said that, you know, if you read the speeches of Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, they're every bit as good as the speeches of Franklin Roosevelt and later presidents. And that maybe if you had an actor kind of read excerpts from, you know, a speech of Coolidge, a speech of Hoover, a speech of Roosevelt, Truman, that he guessed that, you know, maybe people would vote for Hoover and Coolidge over the presidents that typically we identify with, you know, being charismatic. And I think there's much to be said. But again, you know, part of that has to deal with how they approached language. And with Hoover, language wasn't to bring attention to himself. It was clarity and explaining results, which is why his speeches are often laden with kind of wonky, nerdy detail, which, you know, would be welcomed by a handful of people who understood what that meant, but obviously not a broad general public.
Time is kind of slipping away from us, Tom. I have time for one more from Ken Fawcett here. Lincoln had many threats against his life throughout his presidency. Did Hoover have any threats in his 4 years at the White House? I'm thinking there was the one between his election and his inauguration. But were there any in those 4 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right. When he was on the Goodwill tour, there was a thwarted plot to shoot him. And I know that it was always a great concern of the Secret Service. One of kind of the bitter parting elements was that when, after Roosevelt's inauguration and Lou and President Hoover go to the train, the Secret Service detail was removed from them. Franklin Roosevelt didn't allow the Secret Service detail to go with them. And that, you know, given the possibility, I mean, Roosevelt himself was down in Florida and with the mayor from Chicago, Anton Cermak. when an assassin shot at both of them, but killed Cermak. So my guess is that there probably were, which we don't know about. And I don't know, again, if anyone's really looked into it with any great detail. Larry Ritchie had worked with the Secret Service and was one of Hoover's closest associates. So, maybe by having Ritchie around it, they thought maybe they didn't need protection. I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you. I do appreciate all the questions that came in and the comments that people have sent in. We sure appreciate you tuning in and participating in this program tonight. That is all the time we have for questions right now. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Thomas Schwartz, for sharing the research findings and the comparative history between Hoover and Lincoln. As a reminder, this program is being recorded and it will be placed on our website archive on Tuesday morning for you to enjoy and share anytime. So remember, the Presidential Library is now open 7 days a week from 9 to 5. The historic site is under winter hours and they close daily at 4:30. I hope you'll join us next month when National Mining Hall of Fame and Museum Director Elizabeth Dinchell presents The Hoovers and Mining, highlighting the work of Bert and Lou Henry Hoover as they dig through translation of an important 1500s mining text and other adventures in their life together. Registration is now open for that webinar on our website and at your favorite library. Also, remember to visit the Folsom Redemption exhibit, now open through March 19th. This candid and personal photography exhibition covers a critical juncture in the career of Johnny Cash, one of the 20th century's most beloved performers. I also encourage you to nominate an Uncommon Iowa legislator by March 1st and help us recognize uncommon service above and beyond their legislative responsibilities. Use our online form at hooverpresidentialfoundation.org and look under the grants and award tabs for detail. Also, if you know any high school juniors out there who can lead a local service project, encourage them to apply for the Uncommon Student Award Program, where they can earn as much as $11,500 for college. We'll pick 15 students for this program. They will each earn a $1,500 award, and 4 will each earn a $10,000 scholarship. They need to apply by March 15th. Now, the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation. You can learn more about that and even show your support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. There's still time for last-minute gifts, and you qualify for that 25% Hoover state tax credit. So on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.